Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Although countless maritime disasters have occurred over the centuries, few are more evocative than the story of the RMS Titanic. Deemed unsinkable by the press, the Titanic, which at the time was the largest moving man-made object ever built, was on her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York when, just before midnight, on the unusually clear, calm night of April 14th, 1912, she struck an iceberg, gouging a long tear across her hull. The rupture was enough to doom the mighty vessel, and 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the Titanic, with her bow weighed down by flooding water, broke in half, causing the ship's stern to rise up against the starlit sky before plunging into the freezing North Atlantic, taking over 1,500 souls, representing every stratum of society, with it. As an editorial in the Times newspaper noted the following day, "The disaster that has overtaken the Titanic is a forcible reminder of the existence of natural forces which, from time to time, upset all our calculations and baffle all our precautions." Although the Titanic was built in Belfast, registered in Liverpool, sailed from Southampton, and now rests deep beneath the waves, some 370 miles east of Newfoundland, there are many connections to the ill-fated ship, which can be found right here in London. Connections which, when pieced together, help tell the full story of the Titanic. From her very conception, to the passengers and crew who sailed on her, the tragedy itself, and the solemn aftermath. In this video then, I'd like to take you on a tour of London's Titanic sites. So, let's set off and see what we can discover. According to Titanic lore, although it's likely there had already been some discussion beforehand, the story of the legendary ship is generally regarded to have started here, on Belgrave Square, inside this building to be precise, which is now home to the Spanish Embassy. Built in around 1840, and formerly known as Downshire House, this address was once the Grand London residence of Lord William James Pirrie, chairman of the Belfast-based shipbuilders Harland and Wolff. It's said that in the summer of 1907, Joseph Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star shipping line, came here for dinner, during the course of which plans for two huge transatlantic steamships, the Olympic and the Titanic, were discussed. We'll be seeing a lot more of J. Bruce Ismay later. Opened in 1894, Tower Bridge may not seem like an obvious place connected to the Titanic, but once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you may well look at this famous structure in a new light. You see, the metalwork for Tower Bridge was constructed by the Scottish firm Sir William Arrol & Co., the very same firm who, some years later, were contracted by Harland and Wolff to build the huge steel structure known as the Aval Gantry, which, complete with 9 cranes, aided construction of the Olympic-class liners, the Olympic, the Titanic, and later the Britannic. A key figure who worked on the design of the Titanic and her sister ships was Alexander Montgomery Carlisle, a fellow who was born in Ballymena in 1854 and who, throughout his life, lived at 2 London addresses, 12 Hyde Park Place and 7 Orme Square, both of which are off of Bayswater Road. Whilst engaged on the Mammoth project, Carlisle suggested using a new type of davit, the device used to hold lifeboats, which would have doubled the recommended capacity. His recommendation, however, wasn't adopted. Alexander Montgomery Carlisle passed away on the 5th of March 1926 and was cremated at Golders Green Crematorium, where you can see this memorial plaque dedicated to him. The Titanic was completed on the 31st of March 1912, and following trials in Belfast Lough and the Irish Sea, she set sail for Southampton, from where the voyage to New York via Cherbourg in France and Queenstown, now Cove, in Ireland, was due to commence on the 10th of April. By this point in time, Southampton had become the White Star Line's port of choice for transatlantic crossings, largely due to the fact that it was well connected to London by railway. As such, many of the Titanic's passengers spent their last night before departure in London, with the well-heeled booking rooms in the capital's fanciest hotels. It's estimated, for example, that between 20 to 30 parties stayed at the Savoy, whilst another 16 guests were recorded a few doors up at the Cecil Hotel, which no longer exists. Today, the site is occupied by a complex called 80 Strand. Claridge's, meanwhile, accommodated the famous Titanic couple Isidore and Isa Strauss, Isidore being a co-owner of Macy's department store in New York. We'll discover their fate later. Another hotel used by Titanic passengers was the Waldorf on Aldwych, which was opened in 1908 by William Waldorf Astor, a cousin of John Jacob Astor IV, who happened to be the richest passenger on board the Titanic. He did not survive the sinking. A curious incident occurred at the Waldorf on the evening before the ship's departure. A wealthy Scotsman named Colonel John Weir, who had a ticket for the voyage, was in the hotel smoking room with his friends when he suddenly blurted out, "I'm hanged if I'll go tomorrow. I know it sounds absurd, but I've got a funny feeling about going." The following morning, the Waldorf's manager noticed that Colonel Weir was still highly agitated, not helped by the fact that his water jug had mysteriously smashed during the night. Yet, despite his fears, the Colonel did end up boarding the Titanic. He perished in the disaster, and his body was never identified. From London, trains to Southampton depart from Waterloo, and so it was here, on the brisk morning of the 10th of April 1912, that many passengers bound for the Titanic boarded two special boat trains, one for second and third class, and the other solely for first class, which transported them to the port for a direct rendezvous with the ship. One such person who took the boat train was a priest named Francis Browne, whose uncle had gifted him a ticket for the Southampton to Queenstown leg of the voyage. Born in Cork in 1880, Father Browne was an avid photographer who captured many snapshots of life aboard the Titanic, images which have since become invaluable to historians. And the first photographs he took of his adventure were taken right here at Waterloo, on the platform, and from the window of a carriage as the boat train steamed away from the station. Whilst on board the Titanic, Father Browne befriended a wealthy American couple who kindly offered to upgrade his ticket to New York and also pay for his return journey. When Father Browne wired his superior to request permission for an extended holiday though, the reply was terse: "Get off that ship," which he did as originally planned at Queenstown. Incredibly, most of Father Browne's photographs lay hidden away for many decades. The negatives were discovered in his old trunk in 1985, which by coincidence was the same year in which the wreck of the Titanic was finally located. When it came to transatlantic crossings, Cunard, White Star's main rival, boasted the fastest vessels, and so in response, the Titanic and her sister ships were built with luxury as their main selling point. You may not reach your destination as fast, but you'd certainly do it in style. Even third class was considered to be of a better quality than anything that had gone before. One of the most exclusive areas of the Titanic was the first class dining saloon, and the man commissioned to create it was Charles Fitzroy Dole, an architect who specialised in hotel design. His masterpiece, the Hotel Russell, now known as the Kimpton Fitzroy, which opened in 1900, can be seen on Russell Square. And so grand are the details, it's said that it was Charles Fitzroy Dole who inspired the phrase, all dolled up. When designing the Titanic's first-class dining area, Fitzroy Dole used the restaurant he'd created for this hotel as the basis, meaning the two shared architectural similarities. He also commissioned 2 brass dragon statues, one for the hotel, which you can see on the stairway, and the other for the Titanic. It's perhaps no surprise then that, considering his twin now lies some 2.5 miles beneath the Atlantic, this little fellow is affectionately nicknamed Lucky George. Meals on the Titanic, for every class, were based on set menus, and very nice they were too. Although if you were a first-class passenger who didn't mind spending even more, you also had the option of dining at the swankiest venue of all, the Louis XVI themed a la carte restaurant on B deck, where you were presented with a lavish selection of dishes to choose from. The Titanic's a la carte restaurant operated as a private concession, and the man who managed it was an ambitious restaurateur named Luigi Gatti. Although born in Lombardy, Italy in 1875, Luigi was a well-established Londoner by the time he came to the Titanic. As a young man, he'd spent time in Harrow, before marrying his wife Edith in 1902 at St Luke's Church on Oxbridge Road, Shepherd's Bush, which still exists today, although it's since been rebuilt. The pair then set up home at nearby 93 Vespen Road. Over the following years, Luigi went on to manage a number of London restaurants, including one in the Ritz, along with the first-class restaurant on board the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. In 1911, just 1 year before the Titanic sunk, Luigi and Edith resided at 101 Great Titchfield Street, which is now occupied by a modern glass block, although you can gain some idea of what their home would have looked like by looking at the nearby surviving buildings. It was from in and around this part of London's West End that Luigi handpicked many of the staff who'd come to work with him in the Titanic's a la carte restaurant, such as Pompeo Piazza, who lived at the southern end of Shaftesbury Avenue, R. Rubini, who resided at 16 Manette Street, and G. Basilio from 27 Old Compton Street. Those 3 men, along with many more restaurant employees, all died in the disaster, as did Luigi Gatti. Many fixtures, fittings and other components for the Titanic were sourced in London. There were a number of lifts on board, for example, for both freight and passengers, which were installed by the firm Richard Waygood & Co., whose factory was sited here, on Falmouth Road, Borough. Fancy electrical lighting, meanwhile, including chandeliers, were provided by Perry & Co. of 72 New Bond Street, whilst comfy mattresses were made by V-Spring, who were based in Kilburn. Rather more ominously, the davits used to hold the Titanic's lifeboats were provided by the Wedding, Davit and Engineering Company, whose headquarters were at No. 5 Lloyds Avenue. One unusual aspect of the Titanic disaster is that when it struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on the 14th of April 1912, the weather was exceptionally calm. The sea was as gentle as a mill pond, and the sky was crystal clear, illuminated by countless glittering stars. Not the sort of conditions which you'd usually associate with a maritime catastrophe. The Titanic was, famously, kitted out with 16 watertight compartments, which in the event of damage, could be sealed off with gates in order to contain floodwater. Unfortunately, the gash made by the iceberg, which was caused by the ship swerving to avoid a head-on collision, ripped through 5 of those compartments and caused slight damage to a 6th. The Titanic could stay afloat with 4 flooded compartments, but not 5. And as the sea gushed in, she began her slow descent into the abyss. By 12:05 a.m, the gravity of the situation was clear, prompting Captain Edward Smith to order the lifeboat be uncovered. One of the most infamous aspects of the Titanic disaster is that there were not enough of these lifeboats to accommodate everyone. There were over 2,200 people on board, yet the lifeboats only had room for 1,178. Despite this, you may be surprised to hear that the Titanic was actually carrying more lifeboats than was recommended at the time. In the early 20th century, the body responsible for regulating this aspect of shipping was the Board of Trade, which was then located on the now lost Whitehall Gardens, an area now occupied by the Ministry of Defence. In those days, lifeboats were primarily designed to act as small ferries, the assumption being that, in the busy Atlantic shipping lanes, there would always be a vessel close by to assist, and because a ship the size of the Titanic was expected to sink slowly, there would be time for the lifeboats to make several trips between the stricken vessel and any rescuers. As it transpired, this theory was woefully inadequate when it came to the Titanic. Even so, she had 20 lifeboats, despite the Board of Trade stipulating that for a vessel of her size, the maximum requirement was 16. After ordering the lifeboats to be prepared, Captain Smith headed to the Titanic's wireless telegraph office, where he instructed the two operators to send out a distress signal. During the voyage, this small office had been one of the ship's busiest areas. In 1912, the wireless telegraph, which operated using Morse code sent via radio waves, was still a relatively new and novel technology. For a fee, passengers could have messages buzzed to friends and relatives on land, a sort of very early email, which proved immensely popular. The Titanic's two operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Sidney Bride, had their work cut out. Not only were they relaying these many personal messages, but they were also maintaining regular contact with other ships crossing the Atlantic, which included sharing weather information, including ice warnings. The Titanic's wireless office was operated by the Marconi company, named after its founder and the inventor of the wireless telegraph, Guglielmo Marconi. At the time of the disaster, the company's London office was based at this location, Watergate House, York Buildings, close to Charing Cross Station. Born in Bologna, Italy in 1874, Marconi moved to London as a young man, and it was in 1896, at the former General Post Office on Newgate Street near St Paul's Cathedral, that he first demonstrated his wireless system. At the time, he was living at this address on Hereford Road, Notting Hill, which is now marked by a blue plaque. As we heard a moment ago, the two men employed by Marconi on board the Titanic were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. This photograph of the pair was taken by Father Browne. Aged 25, Jack, who was from Surrey, was the senior operator, whilst Harold, at 22, was his junior. Born in Nunhead, Harold was a South London lad, and he grew up in this house on Ravensbourne Avenue, Bromley, close to Shortland Station, which at the time was classed as part of Kent. As you can see, he's commemorated at his old home by this blue plaque. Initially, Jack and Harold used what was then the established distress signal, CQD, although at some point, Harold suggested they should try SOS. In his own half-joking words, "It's the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it." In doing so, they managed to make contact with the RMS Carpathia, which turned and headed at full steam towards the scene, although due to the distance, it would be some 3.5 hours before she could get there. The Titanic didn't have that long. The pair desperately tried to contact the SS Californian too, which was much, much closer. So much so that those on board the Titanic could see it. Although, as not all ships kept a 24-hour radio watch at the time, the California's wireless equipment had been switched off for the night. Jack and Harold fought hard that night. The brave men worked until the very last moment, when water gushed into their office and the Titanic's failing power cut off their equipment. Sadly, Jack died, although miraculously, Harold survived. He was swept off the ship, but managed to cling to an overturned lifeboat, his time in the freezing cold water causing serious injury to his legs. Once on board the Carpathia, and despite suffering frostbite, he worked alongside that ship's operator to help transmit details of those who'd survived back to land. By coincidence, the Carpathia's wireless man was Nottinghamshire-born Harold Cottam, who was good friends with Jack and Harold. All three had trained to be wireless operators at the British College of Telegraphy, which was located at 179 Clapham Road, Stockwell, a site that's now home to a secondary school. One of the most moving aspects of the Titanic disaster is that the ship's in-house band put on an extremely courageous face that night, playing cheerful ragtime music to help calm passengers as lifeboats were lowered and people were separated from their loved ones. The Titanic's band was formed of 8 musicians, who during the normal course of the voyage performed as 2 separate groups. There was Roger Bricou from Burgundy in France, and George Crins, who was Belgian, although for the 2 years prior to being employed on the Titanic, George had lived in London at 10 Villa Road, Brixton, and had made a living by playing at the Ritz. Then there was John Wesley Woodward from West Bromwich, John Clark from Liverpool, Jock Hume from Dumfries, Wallace Hartley, the band's leader, from Lancashire, and William Brayley and Percy Taylor, both of who were Londoners. William was born in Walthamstow, and before boarding the Titanic, he had lived at 71 Lancaster Road, which runs between Ladbroke Grove and Portobello Road. Percy, meanwhile, was born in Hackney, and had been baptised in St Philip's Church on Richmond Road, which sadly no longer exists. It was bombed in the war and demolished in the 1950s, although the church's old war memorial still stands at the spot. In 1906, Percy married his wife Clara at Christchurch, Lambeth, and the pair lived together at No. 9 Fentman Road near Vauxhall. All 8 of these incredibly brave men, whose last tune is widely believed to have been the hymn "Nearer My God to Thee," perished in the disaster. Harold Bride, the wireless operator we met earlier, mentioned the band's performance when testifying at the inquest. "The way the band kept playing was a noble thing," he said. "I was floating out in the sea with my lifebelt on. They were still on deck playing Autumn. How they ever did it, I cannot imagine." Reports of the band's performance on the Titanic had a profound impact on the public psyche, and in May 1912, just a few weeks after the disaster, a memorial concert was held at the Royal Albert Hall in their honour. Proceeds from this event were used to fund a memorial tablet to the band, which was installed inside the National Orchestral Association's headquarters on Archer Street in Soho. Unfortunately, this building is now privately owned, and so it's not possible for the public to see the memorial.
It's the end, boys. We've done our duty. We can go now.
Another group who acted with incredible fortitude that dreadful night were the ship's engineers, who, in the chaos below decks, fought to keep the Titanic's power on for as long as possible, a task they achieved admirably, which both allowed the wireless telegraph to remain online and kept the lights ablaze. Indeed, the ship remained illuminated until the very last moment, the lights finally flickering out at around 2:18 AM, just before the ship broke in half. The bravery of the Titanic's engineers is commemorated by this plaque, which was once located within the former Institute of Marine Engineers at 80 Coleman Street, although it's now on loan to the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Up above, many other profound stories were playing out, such as that of Isidore and Isa Strauss, who, as we saw earlier, had stayed at Claridge's Hotel before boarding the Titanic. By the time of the disaster, Isidore and Isa had been married for over 40 years, and when Isa was offered a space on the lifeboat, she refused. "I will not be separated from my husband," she said. "As we have lived, so we shall die together." One survivor, who recalled seeing Isidore and Isa arm in arm on deck as the Titanic began its precarious slide, stated that the elderly couple presented a most remarkable exhibition of love and devotion. Similar fortitude was displayed by the Scottish Reverend John Harper, a 39-year-old widower who was on board the Titanic with his sister and 6-year-old daughter Annie. John, who had been travelling to America following an invitation to preach in Chicago, was the minister of Walworth Road Baptist Church near Elephant and Castle. Sadly, that church is long vanished. It used to stand between Haygate Street and Wandsey Street. As the Titanic sank, John ensured that his sister and daughter were placed in a lifeboat. He then gave his life jacket to a fellow passenger and stood bravely on deck. Several survivors recalled seeing him and said he was preaching the gospel and offering comfort to the very end. One of the most vivid accounts of the sinking of the Titanic was written by Lawrence Beesley, a former science teacher who'd worked at Dulwich College in South London. Lawrence was one of the few surviving second-class male passengers, a feat he'd managed to achieve after a crew member told him to jump into lifeboat 13 as it was being lowered. From the lifeboat, Lawrence bore witness to the mighty ship's final moments. About this time, 2:15 AM, the water had crept up almost to her sidelight and the captain's bridge, and it seemed only a question of minutes before she sank. The lights still shone with the same brilliance, but not so many of them. Many were now below the surface. And then, as we gazed awestruck, she tilted slowly up until she attained a vertically upright position, and there she remained, motionless. As she swung up, her lights, which had shone without a flicker all night, went out suddenly, came on again for a single flash, then went out altogether, and as they did so, there came a noise which was like the roll and crash of thunder. At the time, Lawrence attributed this ominous sound to the Titanic's engines and other machinery crashing downward, although from what we now know, it was most likely the noise of the ship breaking apart. When the noise was over, Lawrence continues, the Titanic was still upright like a column. We could see her now as the stern, and some 150 feet of her stood outlined against the star-specked sky, looming black in the darkness. She slid slowly forward through the water and dived slantingly down. The sea closed over her, and we had seen the last of the beautiful ship on which we had embarked 4 days before at Southampton. The Titanic's youngest survivor was Millvina Dean, who at the time was just 2 months old. Millvina was born in Branscombe, Devon, although prior to that, her parents, Bertram and Etty, had run a pub in Peckham, the now sadly lost Cooper's Arms, which once stood at 119 Burdin Bush Road, approximately here, where Tortington House is now located. Bertram Dean died in a disaster, although his baby daughter, Millvina, survived, along with her mother and older brother. Millvina went on to work as a civil servant and cartographer, and as well as being the Titanic's youngest survivor, she also became the last living survivor, passing away in 2009 at the age of 97. We'll return now to J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line's chairman, who we first met at the start of this video. Born in Crosby, Lancashire, Bruce Ismay was educated at the prestigious Harrow School and took over the family company when his father, Thomas Ismay, died in 1899. In 1888, Bruce Ismay married his wife Julia at St George's Church, Hanover Square, and in 1911, 1 year before the Titanic disaster, Bruce Ismay purchased this property, 15 Hill Street, Mayfair, close to Berkeley Square, where he and Julia established their family home. It was from here, on the morning of the 10th of April 1912, that Bruce Ismay was driven to Southampton to board the Titanic for her maiden voyage. Officially, he was classed as a passenger, although being the company chairman, he planned to use his time on board to check everything was in order and whether or not any tweaks and improvements could be made. J. Bruce Ismay survived the sinking, but in doing so, he rapidly, and most unfairly, became vilified. Some say he ordered Captain Smith to make the Titanic go faster, thus endangering it, which simply isn't true. Whilst some dramatic portrayals depict him as a selfish man, barging his way past women and children in order to get to a lifeboat. Again, this is grossly dishonest, slanderous in fact, for Bruce Ismay helped passengers into lifeboats, so much so that some crew thought he was getting in the way, and he didn't enter one, a collapsible which were the last to be lowered, until near the end, and he only got into that because there were a number of empty seats and no women and children around to fill them. Why add another figure to what was clearly going to be an appalling death toll? Although Ismay was exonerated of any wrongdoing, the press, seeing the Titanic disaster as the most sensational story of their time, needed a villain, and unfortunately for him, Ismay became the scapegoat, so much so that he came to be dubbed the Coward of the Titanic. Even without this cruel vilification, Bruce Ismay was left a broken man. Becoming something of a recluse, he maintained his Mayfair home, and in later life, when he was diagnosed with diabetes, he underwent an operation at this very address to have his leg amputated. "I never want to see a ship again," he wrote towards the end of his life, "and I loved them so." J. Bruce Ismay died at his Mayfair home on the 17th of October 1937, and he was buried in Putney Vale Cemetery, where you can see his tomb today, tucked away in the graveyard's far southwestern corner. Of those who ended up in the sea once the Titanic had sunk, few survived, with many victims quickly succumbing to hypothermia. This whistle, which you can see inside the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, saved one such person from the freezing cold water, a fellow named Cecil Fitzpatrick, who worked on the Titanic as a steward. When he blew it, a group from Lifeboat 12 heard his call for help and pulled him on board. In a similar situation was Feng Lung, one of 8 Chinese passengers aboard the Titanic. The 8 men, 6 of who survived, were travelling together in 3rd class for work, and prior to boarding the Titanic, they'd lodged in Limehouse, which at the time was the heart of London's Chinese community. After the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves, Feng Lung found himself clinging to a piece of wreckage, a door to be precise, and he was rescued by Lifeboat 14, which ventured back to help those freezing in the water. Feng Lung went on to live a long life. He passed away in 1986, at the age of 91. One of his colleagues, Chang Chip, wasn't so fortunate. Although he survived the Titanic disaster, he returned to London soon after, but sadly died of pneumonia just 2 years later in 1914, at the age of 32. At the time of his death, Chang was living at 46 Upper North Street, Poplar, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in a London cemetery. Most likely the East London Cemetery, although unfortunately no one knows for sure. Another notable survivor was Charles Herbert Lightoller, the Titanic's second officer and the most senior crew member to survive. As the ship sank, Charles dived into the sea, an experience he compared to having 1,000 knives being driven into one's body. Charles Lightoller was the last survivor to be pulled aboard the Carpathia, and he went on to lead a remarkable life. He served with the Navy in World War I, and in World War II, he captained one of the many small vessels used in the Dunkirk evacuation. In 1947, Charles, in partnership with an old friend, took over a small boat building business in Richmond, which was located beside the Thames at number 1 Ducks Walk, opposite the northern end of Riverdale Gardens, where you can see this plaque detailing his life. In the first few hours following the sinking of the Titanic, there are mixed reports. Some wires in London heard that all on board had been saved, and this was even reported as fact in the early editions of some newspapers. However, it didn't take long for the true horror of the tragedy to emerge, and that solemn realization is perhaps best evoked by this famous photograph, which shows a newspaper boy named Ned Parfett standing outside Oceanic House, White Star's main London office, near Trafalgar Square, as people gathered around for news and information. Some time ago, I devoted an entire video to Ned, who lived with his family near Waterloo Station. If you'd like to watch that, I'll leave a link below. White Star had a second office in London, which was located here, at 38 Leadenhall Street, in the city's financial square mile. As news came through, a reporter from the Globe newspaper observed the number of people turn up here, anxious for news of friends and relatives. One elderly lady, for some time, walked up and down in the offices of the company, her eyes red with tears. Two nurses in uniform, after inspecting the lists of those known to have been saved, went away very agitatedly, one remarking to the other, "I told you so. He is gone." Insurance for the Titanic had been brokered by Lloyds of London, who back in 1912 were based inside the Grand Royal Exchange building. Today they occupy this distinctive 1980s tower on nearby Lime Street. The ship had been insured for $1 million, about $135 million in today's money, with the risk spread amongst 70 underwriters, and although a huge amount, this was only about half of what the Titanic was worth. After all, who would have thought such a ship would ever sink? When news of the Titanic's fate came in, the disaster was recorded in Lloyd's Lost Book on the 16th of April 1912. You can sometimes see this ledger on display, open at that very page, during London's annual Open House Festival. In the wake of the disaster, 2 inquiries were held into the sinking of the Titanic, one in New York, the other in London. The London inquiry, which took place from the 2nd of May to the 3rd of July 1912, was held at the London Scottish Drill Hall, which used to be located at 59 Buckingham Gate, but later moved a short distance here to Horseferry Road. Around 100 experts, survivors and witnesses appeared at the inquiry, including people we've already met in this video, such as Harold Bride, Marconi, Harold Cotton, and J. Bruce Ismay. Other notable people from the Titanic story also gave evidence here, such as Frederick Fleet, the lookout who'd first spotted the iceberg, and the ship's baker, Charles Joffin, who'd managed to survive in the freezing cold Atlantic for some 2 hours, a feat no doubt helped by the fact that he'd downed a huge amount of whiskey before entering the water. On the 19th of April 1912, a large memorial service was held at St Paul's Cathedral, which was attended by over 10,000 people, with those who couldn't get inside crowding around the surrounding streets. One of the many mourners present was Alexander Carlisle, who had worked on the ship's design before retirement, and so overwhelmed was he with grief, the poor fellow collapsed and had to be taken home in an ambulance. Today, a number of permanent memorials to specific individuals who died on the Titanic are dotted around London. This one, for example, on Victoria Embankment, honours William Thomas Stead, the former editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, who, in an eerie twist, had often joked that he'd die of either lynching or drowning. He once even published a short story entitled From the Old World to the New, which involved the ship striking an iceberg. William Stead is also commemorated by this plaque at his former home, 5 Smith Square in Westminster. This sundial commemorates Christopher Head, a former mayor of Chelsea whose body was never recovered. Unfortunately, this memorial lies within Cadogan Place Garden, which is private and locked off. This memorial plaque, meanwhile, inside the Church of St Edmund the King on Lombard Street, honours Charles Melville Hayes, the former president of Canada's Grand Trunk Railway, a company whose sign you can still see on Warwick House Street, close to Trafalgar Square. In more recent years, a small memorial garden dedicated to all of those who died in the tragedy was established outside the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. This peaceful little spot was unveiled on the 15th of April 1995, the 83rd anniversary of the sinking, in the presence of 2 survivors, Edith Heisman and Eva Hart. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tour of London's Titanic sites, and as always, I'd love to hear your own thoughts. Do you think J. Bruce Ismay was unfairly treated? Would you have gotten into a lifeboat, or taken a chance on deck? And are there any other Titanic links you can think of, whether they be in London or elsewhere? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. If you haven't yet subscribed to Robslondon, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, would ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus, of course, it'd be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.